Thanks, Hayden. Great to be here. I haven't practiced my slides, but I'm aiming for a Anders Sandberg level of pinpoint accuracy on the 7 minutes. So here we go. Today I wanted to talk about essentially answering this question of how policy relevant are we as a field. I started by basically collecting all the publications over the 2016 to 2021 period, focusing on obviously those publications, academic articles, government submissions and reports that are specifically relevant to the field, whittling down from a long list of 758 articles that sort of came up in my search. 376 of those were directly relevant to existential and global catastrophic risk. And of those, 190 of those were identified as directly relevant for policy. When I break that down a little bit further, so just over half of that of those publications in general were policy relevant, where they specifically stated policy implications or policy ideas and options. Interestingly, over the last few years, the number of publications has been pretty steady and the policy relevance has been pretty steady. Breaking it down by risk category, the top two sort of categories were general, essentially meaning where the publication was focused on either multiple risks at the same time or just talking generally about existential and global catastrophic risk. Technology was the second highest category. That was almost entirely AI, though nanotech and a few other things popped up in that category as well. And then we see that wasn't, that didn't change so much once it went down to the policy relevant publications. Similarly, general risk and technological risk were the most policy relevant, and then biological and environmental risks had the next level of policy relevance. What I did then is look at, well, which of those policy relevant publications included policy ideas. So of the 190 policy relevant ideas, policy relevant publications, 68 of those provided policy ideas, at least one. If it just had one, that was enough. And of those 68, I've captured so far 29 of those sources into a database where I've collected the policy ideas. So far, I've captured 298 policy ideas from those 29 sources. Most of those ideas fall into two sort of policy intervention categories: governing risk and understanding risk. Somewhat surprisingly for me, preventing and preparing had much less policy ideas, though the sort of big caveat I would say there is that given that I've captured only 29 of the 68, I may be missing many publications that do focus on prevention and preparation. But so far, that's at least the focus has been primarily on those two categories. So if I sort of summarize, how policy relevant I think we are is, at least when it comes to the publications that are coming out of the field, over half are directly relevant, and we're pumping out a lot of policy ideas. It's really about translating that into practical policy advice. So I'm going to leave in the spirit of giving practical recommendations. These are sort of 5 recommendations I've come up with. Firstly, maybe we should focus more where policy relevant work is underweighted. So nuclear weapons and extreme climate change might be 2 areas we might need to focus a little bit more on. AI has a lot of policy ideas, but they're lacking specificity. So we might also need to put a bit more effort there. We might need to focus more policy ideas towards prevention preparedness. I think we've got understanding and governing risk reasonably well handled, at least in terms of ideas. Maybe we need to shift a little bit of our focus. Making the policy implications very clear. 40% of the publications made claims, but that may or may not be relevant to policymakers, but they didn't make that very specific link, and therefore, policymakers aren't necessarily going to pick up what you're putting down. So making those very clear implications, even if you don't venture into providing policy ideas or policy proposals. I think developing more translation products and services, so being able to take their policy ideas and putting them into the more digestible formats, so that's something that you can actually put in front of a policymaker. A self-promoting one, if you want to help me with my completing these two databases, the research database and the policy ideas database, I'm more than open to people's support. And a bonus recommendation, just a shout out to Clarissa, who's obviously leading some session tomorrow. I've been following definitely her lead in the amazing work that she's doing on policy relevant and policy relevant engagement. So, translating all of this policy research into a engagement strategy with our policy counterparts. And I'll pause there.
You came in at about 6 minutes. So actually, assuming you don't want to kind of vamp for a minute or so, looking around the room for questions on this topic. I would note, obviously, tomorrow we're going to be having, quite a substantial day on talking about policy and how we can make these ideas relevant to policy. So we'll be getting into this at more depth tomorrow. But yeah, if I can go to you.
Thank you. I noticed that your highest percentage was govern, 45%, and I was wondering what that actually meant. Was that trying to affect governance, or what was the main content in relation to govern?
Yeah, essentially that was it. It was mostly relating to those structures, putting in place structures that govern risk at a sort of broad level. So it might be international or national level governance structures. It could be things like, say, like putting in risk management frameworks and structures, or future generations bills, or those sorts of things that relate to sort of future generations. It might be things like chief risk officers, so sort of like the bureaucratic and legislative structures that underpin risk efforts, as opposed to specific reduce this threat, increase our resilience here, reduce the vulnerability there. So it's much more about that sort of the underpinning governance structures.
Yeah, I'm wondering how how did you go about doing the search for all of the papers? I know there's some projects existing for like Terra, for instance, for trying to track all existing X-risk relevant papers. So I'm wondering what you used for that. If it was just manual, or
Yeah, I used the bibliography that Terra conveniently provides a sort of downloadable CSV. So I started there, and then it was all pretty much manual. I went organization by organization and found all the articles that they publish or put on their own websites. I know there's some work that's undergoing to take Terra to the next level, but sort of this is a bit of a, it's definitely not going to replace an automated process like that. But it was useful, particularly for identifying, at least the manual element became, not only collecting them, but figuring out how policy relevant are they, which ones have policy ideas, and then translating it over into the sort of other separate database.
Congratulations for trawling through all of those documents. You're a brave man. Yeah.
Mike Cassidy. So I was just wondering, have you looked at, or will you be looking at kind of the sort of the other side of it, how successful those policies put forward have been? And if so, were these kind of academic publications in specific global policy sort of journals, or were they kind of more nuanced and stuff like that? It'd just be interesting to see the kind of next stage, and if you're thinking about that.
Yeah, there's a few evolutions, I guess, to go through on this piece of work. I mean, the first is trying to tick off the remaining 40 or so publications that to catalog the ideas that are there. And I think there's an element of providing some judgments about which ones are at certain quality levels. So we might want to upvote, and promote certain policy ideas that we think are good. I think then the sort of further evolution beyond that is then working out, well, where have certain policies been implemented that we may have picked up, that we may have proposed, how successful have they been, and even taking our search a bit wider and going, okay, this is what the existential risk field proposes, but what's the next sort of circle of related organizations? What are they proposing? So there's lots of different ways the scopes can grow. I think that the first step is just cataloging what do we actually think policymakers should do. Let's just start there, and then we can sort of build on that.